Chancellor's big idea and the coalition government's big idea was that you cut back on spending, you get debt and deficit under control, and the private sector surges forward. It takes up the slack and drives the recovery. That hasn't happened, has it? Why not?
Look at it. What he did was bet that he'd get 5 years' growth at pushing 3% in the last budget. He ain't getting it. He didn't actually cut expenditure in pound signs. Parts of the economy were allowed to rise, parts were allowed to fall. The state remained at about half the economy. The economy grows slower when the public sector's over about 40%. We need to get the public sector down. He hoped growth would do that for him. So he'd hold them spending roughly static, and the growth would mean that gradually the percentage that the state had of the total economy would decline and growth would return. But he hasn't got that growth. He's actually faced with some really nasty alternatives. The thing he should be doing is cutting public expenditure more. Most of the economists will tell him not to do that. It's happened many times before. But I bet you, in fact I can bet pretty safely because he isn't going to do it, that actually the economy would improve quicker with harsher medicine rather than this dragging it out.
But harsher medicine, but there are 5 unemployed people chasing every vacancy in the economy at the moment. Almost 6, actually. The ratio is that high, but you can't have half a person. Given that the private sector isn't creating enough new jobs to bring unemployment down, I mean, is it sensible to keep turfing people out of their jobs in the public sector?
Well, if you just have more people into the public sector, we'll have even less growth. And that means that over time we'll have even more unemployment and more poverty.
Explain the logic of that. Why does a big public sector mean less growth, in your view?
Because basically the public sector only has bits of it that contribute to economic growth. A large public sector means that the economy can only grow slower because the engine of real growth, which is the private sector, is smaller. We need a bigger private sector. Some countries have done it, some quite extraordinarily, often with pain, sometimes without. The UK cut 7% out of public spending in the 1990s and grew at 3.5% compound while it did it. Love to do that again. We haven't been anywhere near it. Estonia cut their legs out their public spending 2 years ago, and they were fastest growing economy in Europe.
So if the private sector is the engine of growth, it's one that's spluttering at the moment. Now, the government's bringing down corporation tax, it's credit easing, it's helping banks raise money and making it cheaper to borrow money, it's making it easier for companies to fire people, it's encouraging apprenticeships. Is it missing a trick here? Is there something it's not doing?
You can stick any fuel you like in a Mini, but it still won't tow a supertanker. You need to make the private sector bigger relative to the public sector, which means you've got to move people and resources out of the public sector back to the private. There were 1 million people, roughly, moved from the private sector to the public sector during the last government. We need to move them back again.
But how do you do that? What is the government not doing it should be that would enable that to happen?
It's got to cut the size of the state. If the jobs aren't there, the competent people will find jobs in the private sector. Yes, there'll be a few months' pain and grief. There will. Might be a year or two.
And we just have to accept higher unemployment as a consequence.
For a short period. Would you like a couple of years of grief or 10 years of grief? Personally, I'd go for the 2.
OK. Labour has a 5-point plan.
Yep.
It's different. It thinks the Chancellor should change course. It would cut VAT, national insurance, tax breaks, a tax on bank bonuses, which it says will create 100,000 jobs. It doesn't say if it's in the private or the public sector. Do you think any of those are good ideas that the government should perhaps take on board?
Not really. Sorry. I mean, cutting VAT, cutting taxation actually is only feasible when you've cut the size of the public sector quite a bit. Otherwise, we just run a massive deficit. The currency will go to hell. People won't buy our gilts. Interest rates will go out of control. Welcome to the 1970s.
Oh, on that final thought, Jon Moulton, thank you very much. You've cheered us all up. This is Jeff Randall Live. Coming up after the break, more bad news. Fears of a Eurozone recession loom as its economy contracts.